Today we're focusing on reading narrative texts and answering questions on these in section 1 of the exam. Now, these are the areas where people have the biggest weakness, the narrative text. I think it's the area where people really struggle with because they don't know a lot of the language techniques, and then they're struggling to come up with things to write about. And sometimes you'll see some texts are really, really short and it's hard to find the ideas. If you think back to the Year 11 ETA exam last year, remember that tiny little passage that you got given? It was about 6 sentences long and you had to come up with an idea from that. But there was a lot of imagery used and a lot of sense imagery. So it's about really knowing the language use. So as I said last week, it's about really knowing your conventions as well. So your narrative conventions are things like point of view, whether it's first or third, characterization, and everything that involves, which is, how they speak, how they act, appearance, and what others think of them. Now, in these short extracts, though, you may not get a lot of detail about the character. So you have to sort of make judgments by the little that you get. You've also got things like conflict and climax in the plot, the time it's set, and even the form. Then you've got your language techniques, and these are the ones that are really convey the tone of the text and tell us, what the overall meaning is. So you've got metaphors or figurative language such as similes, metaphors, or personification. So this is one of our bugbears, is the fact that people talk about the author uses figurative language. You need to tell us what it is. Same as the next one, diction and lexical choice. So a lot of students like to say the author uses lexical choice or the author uses diction. Diction means words and lexical choice means the arrangement of words. So literally you're saying the author uses words. It's pretty ironic. Of course they use words. Pretty hard to write a story without words. So you need to say what type of words. Like, are they angry or aggressive? Are they soft words? Do they have soft sounds to them? Are they alliterative words where they repeat the S letter or the T letter or a P letter? Are they action words? Are they, lots of verbs that describe movement? So you have to pull apart what types of words that they're using. So it's okay to talk about lexical choice and diction, and in fact you should do, because every time you choose a word, it creates the tone. So if you have lots of aggressive verbs in it, then you get an aggressive tone to the story. If you have lots of soft sounding words, so if you think back to the ETA exam in semester 1 and the Tim Winton piece, if you'd really gone in and analysed that, you would have noticed that along with him talking about swimming, there was lots of S sounds throughout the words. There was lots of assonance and alliteration, words starting with S, words had S in the middle. There was a lot of that soft sound because it was making you think like water. As opposed to hard sounds. So the tone that it created was soft and loving and maternal because of the softness of those words. So a few more techniques. There's a rule of 3. A lot of narrative and non-fiction writers use rule of 3. There's allusion often to famous places, events. There's polysyndeton. Tim Winton particularly likes this. It's when they use conjunctions that they don't need to. So are hosting a Super Bowl party and we're getting the same crew together for beer and chips and wings and pizza and football and popcorn and probably some weird commercials. So the and there, you normally would get rid of them and have commas, but by repeating that, it makes it sound, makes the list longer and makes it sound more dramatic and more busy. And then you've got asyndeton, where you eliminate the conjunctions between phrases, and that causes your sentence to be really terse and quick. So there's lots more than that, but you need to memorize them and put them on charts around your room. So this text here, I'm not going to do much on it because it has been done a lot, but people struggled with this text and didn't know what to write about. But if you look at the very first lines, it's using imagery from the start. The snake moves like mercury poured. So straight away, the snake is metallic. Mercury is a dangerous metal. It's poisonous to humans in many forms. It uses the verb poured. So we get this softness. So we get an idea of soft danger, like it's not soft in a gentle way. And it continues this sort of scientific type of language, calculated overdoses. And here, cells saturated by poison. So all of the language, all of the diction about the snake is deadly poisonous diction. And then the lizard that's getting defeated by the snake, you can see it says its obstinate survival instincts. The blue tongue has put up a fight. The lizard forces its tough body and crazed mind to resist. Its tail arc signalling its insolence and complete hopelessness. So there's a bit of juxtaposition there because it's insolence. Insolence means, just don't care, and then hopelessness because it has no chance of winning. So one of the other big things that we're finding is that the vocab in a lot of you students is really weak. Okay, like you don't have the vocab to understand a lot of the words that are in these texts. And you really need to work on reading a lot of texts that come across in class and taking a note of lists of words that you don't know and looking them up. Okay, so straight away the question was, how does the text convey an idea about the snake? If you go on and read it, and a lot of people didn't seem to read it all, it went over the other page. It talks about the snake as being something feared when Vincent talks about it, and we get the idea that Vincent, we know that Vincent is an Aboriginal man, and then because he says, us Aborigines, Dreamtime snakes. But what a lot of people missed is, yes, he feared the snake, but he also respects it, because people didn't read to the end. So the biggest thing about these narratives is always read to the end and see what's happening, because often they've deliberately chosen to end the text at that point because they want to see you understand that flip from one belief to another. So refresh your memory of language techniques and narrative conventions. So as a practice, you could go through this text and find other bits of imagery. You can try and write a practice response and bring them in, trying to use more techniques to talk about it. So here you all have the characterization of Vincent, and so on and so forth. Now, when I asked for an idea, these are big ideas in the course. It doesn't mean like, the idea that the snake is poisonous. That's very literal. What they're thinking is big ideas like what does it suggest about nature? It suggests nature sort of is cruel and ruthless. Some people said that the snake was a metaphor for white people coming in and invading the land. But what I didn't like about that interpretation was the fact that he says, oh, the snake is our mother. So if you're turning around saying the snake represents the white people killing off, and they said the goanna, who is the Aboriginal people, like, that, fair call, that's an all right analysis, except you're ignoring this bottom bit where he talks about loving the mother snake and how much it meant to them. So really, they wouldn't believe a snake represented the white people because to them the snake was their mother. So be careful to read to the end and make sure you see both sides of the story. I've made some notes there in the first paragraph. So as a practice activity, you can go and make notes in the other one and try and write them up as paragraphs. Okay, so we're going to do this one from last year. So what we're finding in the exams is the non-fiction texts are tending to be non-fiction narratives. They're not your old texts with lots of facts and details. They're more about real people telling real stories. And this is something that we've just had you do in class. And we've emphasised the need for you to tell your personal story. So a lot of these are featuring in the exams as well. So first of all, the contextual information. People miss this all the time. This is an excerpt from Australian singer Tim Rogers' 2017 autobiography. If he's an Australian singer, would we assume he's a grown-up? Yeah? Well, the amount of people that said he was a child, it astounded me. Like, all these people were saying, oh, it was a child feeling sorry for his father. And I'm like, he's a grown-up. He's got a singing career. He's not a child star. I think it would tell us that. All right, so you have to read the context information. I talked about this last week in the visual text and said people didn't read the title, which was Me, Earl and the Dying Girl, and they made up this whole convoluted story about the two friends falling out because one was racist because one was black and one was white. And it was like, it's quite clear that in the title, Me, Earl and the Dying Girl, the missing girl was the cause of the conflict, or you would assume. All right, so this one didn't have a lot of figurative language, but the question was, how is the father-son relationship represented through the construction of the narrator's voice? First of all, you have to understand voice. Voice can be narrative voice or authorial voice, but this is an autobiography, so they're both the same thing. So what is his voice conveying? It's a way of conveying, your beliefs, your thoughts, your actions. It's a way of how they convey everything. So the grand final is played in the neighbouring town of Boulder at the Digger Dawes Oval, as onomatically perfect an oval as it is physically. So what he's saying here, onomatically perfect, he's talking about the title, Digger Dawes Oval, and he's saying the name of it is onomatically perfect, Digger Dawes. Like onomata is when things sound like the action. The short cab ride there had us a little pensive. Although I have no emotional investment in the game, I want this to be a great experience for Dad. Now, he says I've no emotional investment in the game. I want this to be great for Dad. But then he goes on to say we have an interest in the big league. So a lot of people last year got stuck on this, I've got no emotional investment, and kept talking about it and saying, oh, he doesn't like footy. No, he just is not invested in the teams that are playing. So he goes on. So straight away we've got this, I want this to be a great experience for Dad. So he cares about his dad's feelings and brought him to this footy game, even though he doesn't really care whether they win or lose, because he wants his dad to experience the fun of the football. Mine more rabid. We've both got an interest in the big league. Mine more rabid than his, but we've always shared stories about the country games we've seen and recall the local women's leagues and the suburban kids games with great fondness. So there's a lot of this sense of history here in this anecdote. There's a lot of shared interest in football, and that's all building the relationship. They have shared interests. They enjoy each other's company. They choose to go to places together. I've seen spellbinding performances on grand stages. So he's talking about his singing career. But still, my favourite footy story is how Dad and his mates would finish training on a cold Wednesday night, buy a big loaf of bread, pour out the fluffy innards and stuff it with hot salty chips as a reward for the walk home. So here you've got lots of imagery, lots of sense imagery, such as cold and hot, and taste imagery to set the scene. Oh, the steam that would plume out of that freezing trek. And then he goes on to tell more anecdotes about his uncle. They swapped jerseys or Guernseys with the opposition team, but he says when the crowd had dissipated, he hastily dug a ditch in the middle of the oval, threw the jumper in it, set it on fire, pissed on it, steam no doubt also abundant, and then buried it. So there's a bit of this rivalry and a bit of, the humorous story of his uncle and his dad in their footy days. So we get the idea that, one, they're a close family and that he looks up to his father. Now, we flick to the next one, and this is in the present. So all of that sort of in the past, and it's a reflection. The tone created is very nostalgic. It's for the good old days when he was a child and, he looked up to his father and his father was his hero. Then here it changes to the present. I doubt there'll be steam even in the hot dog broiler at the Oval today. Weather is my least favourite subject to discuss after religion and personal training, but it's a perfect day for country footy and its spectators. So again, people jumped on this about, I don't like to talk about the weather and he doesn't like it. It's just a throwaway comment. I don't like talking about the weather. That's a euphemism. Like when people say they're talking about the weather, it's usually something people do when you're not friendly with them. Like, you know what it's like when you're talking to someone who's almost a complete stranger and they're like, how are you? Yep, I'm good. And it's like, oh, the weather today, it's terrible. It's basically like you do it because you have nothing in common with this person and nothing to talk to them about. So you resort to the weather. So he's basically saying, I'm not being that boring person. I'm not talking about the weather. But then he's saying it is particular to this story. He's basically, in a long roundabout way, doing this big use of imagery to set the scene as a hot day. Dry and warm, the sky's so bereft of cloud. Now, the imagery here is beautiful, the bereft of cloud. So bereft means, without. So it's usually in a negative way, like she was bereft at the death of her husband. But in this case, he basically uses that word in a positive, saying there's no clouds to mar the sky. Like a full head of hair sprung free from a ponytail. So his use of simile there again, really poetic language. And I mean, it says at the top he's an Australian singer, so we assume he writes his own songs. So we can get the idea from that contextual information and from all this wonderful imagery that he's quite poetic. Even the fact onomatopoeia, the fact that he knows what onomatopoeia is. He's obviously not your everyday footy larrikin or uneducated. He's obviously quite, poetic and, he's setting the scene like he would with a song. Skills will be on full display. Jackets and scarves won't. The one grandstand at Digger Dawes is half an oval away where the cab has dropped us. And though Dad's excellent cheer is an excellent cheer and protests my assistance, there have been enough falls and injuries lately for me to be a little cautious. Now, here's the turning point in this story. The dad that was the hero that used to play footy back in the old days, that was a part of this funny story with his uncle, is now all of a sudden quite weak and needs assistance. And it says he's had enough falls and injuries lately for me to be a little cautious. We take our time to walk there, mingling with the crowd of about 2,000. So a lot of people miss that because it's just 2 lines within the text, but that shows that he cares for his father, and his father's getting old and fragile. So we're seeing a change in the relationship. At the beginning, the relationship is all about hero worship and enjoying the time with his dad and caring for his dad. And at the end, it's more about going back to, I suppose, that first idea. He just wants his dad to be happy. He just wants to care for his dad. And he realizes his dad's not as strong anymore. So the relationship is not simple. And then it ends on, it's a joy to see so much colour and vibrancy. So it ends on that whole idea of, it's a wonderful experience. So like I've said before, I always say to people, try and write it in a couple of paragraphs, because I find that a lot of the short responses, the questions ask for a couple of things. What I would do in this one, because the relationship changes, I would almost do the relationship in the past, and then it says how it's constructed through the narrator's voice. So the narrator's voice uses imagery, it uses anecdote, it uses, what else did we say? It uses sensory imagery as well. It uses poetic devices. Like he uses onomatopoeia himself. I'm just going to write onoma. He uses a lot of the poetic devices that he mentions. Then the second paragraph, I would write about the relationship now and how the father is changing. He's getting old. So we have to spend our time really pulling apart these narrative texts, and you don't have to know, if you're unsure if something is alliteration or assonance or consonants, that's fine. Just talk about it and say it uses the diction is a repetition of the S sound. Okay, the fact that you're identifying and noticing the repetition of those sounds, or the repetition of the hard words or the aggressive words, that's good enough. Like, you don't have to memorize, alliteration, onomatopoeia, assonance, consonants, and all the rest of them. But if you can recognize that, that author's deliberately using lots of D words, why is he doing that? And even if you think about the sound of those words as well. So if you thought about the sound of the words in Tim Winton's piece, they were all soft. They were all very gentle. There was no harsh sounds, because he was trying to convey the idea of that he loved that water, and that the water was embracing him, and that we associated all those sounds with that sense of comfort. So the best thing to do now is to try and write up those paragraphs as a practice, and give them for review. And we might do that towards the end, but we're going to try on these 2 texts. So these 2 were from a sample that SCASA have loaded onto the resources for ATAR. So again, have to read the contextual information. We must find out about the context at all times. This is an edited passage from the novel The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. It describes the arrival of the Greek army at Troy. It's narrated by Patroclus, one of the Greek warriors. Okay. We gained the beach and pulled the ships up onto the sand. Scouts were sent ahead to watch for further Trojan ambush, and guards were posted. Hot though it was, no one took off his armour. All right, so we've got an idea of the heat, so that the scene is set, but we also, no one took off his armour. So, and we've got the words like ambush. So we've got the antagonist straight away, which is the Trojan army. We've got this concept that it's hot, and we're going to continue with that. And the armour means they're on alert, ready for battle. So the imagery here goes on about the heat. The sun beat down on us. It seemed brighter here, but perhaps that was only the whiteness of the sand. We walked until we came to a grassy rise springing from the beach. It was crescent-shaped, cradling our future camp at the side and back. At its top was a forest that spread east toward a glinting river. To the south, Troy was a smudge on the horizon. So see the imagery here. It's very beautiful considering they've come to this enemy's beach. It's hot and a bit overwhelming, but the narrator can see the beauty in the place. And even the place where they've camped, they feel protected. They've said cradling, so, referring back to babies and them being cradled and protected. And then Troy was a smudge, so it's quite negative. It's like Troy was something dirty and in the way. We stood on a hill that marked the boundary between sand and grass and regarded the thing we'd come for, Troy. It was separated from us by a flat expanse of grass and framed by two wide, lazy rivers. Even so far away, its stone walls caught the sharp sun, and gleamed. We fancied we could see the famous Scaean Gate, its brazen hinges said to be as tall as man. Later I would see those walls close up, their sharp, squared stones perfectly cut and fitted against each other, the work of the god Apollo, it was said, and I would wonder at them, at how ever the city could be taken, for they were too high for siege towers and too strong for catapults. So that there is what Polysyndeton, it's where you didn't need the too high and the too strong. You just could have said they were too high and strong, but they use it to emphasize the size of the city. So the city has been portrayed as almost like a jewel. It's, gleaming, catching the eye. It has these big, wonderful gates, brazen hinges, tall as man. So there's lots of awe about this famous place. And even it seems like the earth itself considers it an artwork because it's being framed by rivers. No sane person would ever try and climb the sheer, divinely smooth face. So even the fact that the gates are referred to divinely smooth, like as if divinely refers to God, obviously. So it's almost like the city is made by God. Raiding was typical of siege warfare. You would not attack the city, but the lands that surrounded it, that supplied it with meat and grain. You would kill those who resisted, make serfs of those who did not. All their food went to you now, and you held their daughters and wives as hostage to their loyalty. Those who escaped would flee to the city for sanctuary. Quarters would quickly grow crowded and mutinous. Disease would arise. Eventually, the gates would have to open out of desperation, if not honour. All right, so this whole thing here basically shows that our protagonist or our narrator is not the good guy, really. And it's almost like this is narrated by the antagonist of the story because the actions he talks about are very dishonourable. And Troy is always named as, a city that is beautiful. It was made by the gods. The doors were made by the gods. All the things that they see are worded in a positive way. All the imagery, glinting river, cradling, all the sun beat down on us. So it's almost like the land itself is opposing these people. And the narrator feels that they're wrong to be there. And he feels that they can't possibly win. Unless they do, they'll win through being dishonourable. So the question is how narrative point of view in text 1 constructs a perspective on the city of Troy and its surroundings. So what I would do would be doing all about the admiration of Troy and talking about those metaphors, the reflection on nature and the godlike references. And then there's almost this in the second paragraph, it's almost pity towards Troy because he knows what they're going to do will be brutal. So a lot of the times the ideas that are coming out are quite complex. Right? They're not your simple, like, it just doesn't give one point of view of Troy. It gives this multifaceted point of view. All right, so that was response 1 in that sample exam. Response 2 had another text on Troy, and it wanted to be a comparative one. They wanted you to compare the first response to Troy to the second response. Now, the good thing about these is you've just written about text 2. So it suits, the comparative one suits perfectly to have 2 paragraphs. One paragraph would be about text 1, all the while referring to how it differs to text 2. So the question says, discuss the details of setting in text 2 that present ideas about the city of Troy that are different from the ideas presented in text 1. So we've already written a paragraph about how Troy is presented through all of these metaphors and references to gods and references to nature, lots of admiration. So we've got the ideas in our head. That paragraph, you should be able to just flow it out. So you just have to analyse the next text and think about how it compares to that first one. So our contextual information, this passage is taken from part 2 of the novel Ransom by David Malouf. It describes the city of Troy and introduces its king Priam. So laid out on the uneven ground along a rocky bluff, Troy is a city of 4 square towers topped by untidy stalks next, each as tall as a man. So straight away, our imagery, uneven ground, rocky bluff, untidy stalks. In the very first line, the representation of Troy is different. We can tell that in the first sentence. If we pull apart these texts, we realise there's so much more to them than we expected. So it's negative. If you're going to call this diction, you would say there's lots of negative, uneven, untidy diction. I'm having a blank on what to call it. As tall as man, dovecote, cisterns, yards where black goats are penned, and in a maze of cobbled squares and alleys, houses of whitewashed mud, brick and stone, cube-shaped with open stairwells that at this hour mount to dreams. Now look at all that listing. That was hard for me to say in one breath. And that's because they're trying to make it seem busy. They're trying to make the setting seem overwhelming, like with lots and lots of things. The other author, or narrator, sorry, spoke about how Troy gleamed in the distance, how it was beautiful, how it was godlike, how it was nestled by nature, surrounded by a river. This author is talking about how busy it is, how full, how overwhelming. On the flat roofs under awnings of woven rush, potted shrubs spread their heavy night odours, and cats of the haughty, small-skulled breed that are native to the region prowl the parapets and yowl like tormented souls in their mating. Now, this imagery here, heavy night odours. So instead of talking about the niceness of those plants or the lovely smells, he calls them heavy. And the cats themselves are haughty, they're small-skulled, and they prowl like aggressors, and they yowl like tormented souls mating. So all of these negative descriptions add up to create a negative tone and a negative image of Troy. Tucked between the rocky outcrops are the kitchen gardens with a fig tree, a pomegranate, a row or two of lettuce or broad beans, a clump of herbs where snails the size of a baby's fingernails are reborn in their dozens after a storm and hang like raindrops of every stalk. So again, you've got this listing occurring, making it seem busy and overwhelming. Here for 11 nights, Priam had been wrestling with dark thoughts as he lies sleepless on his couch. But sleepless in his case, like so much everything else in his life, is a manner of speaking. It is what he feels is proper to his grief. Okay, so we've got the main character being introduced, and we need to go to the quest. The question says, discuss the details of setting in text 2 that present ideas about the city that are different from the ideas presented in text 1. So we find out that Priam, who is its king, is grieving and reflecting upon his city and can't sleep. In fact, he has slept, but so fitfully, picking his way past eddies of murky flame and corpses heaped in piles round fallen archways or crammed into wells, that is when he wakes. It is to deeper exhaustion. So again, we've got all this imagery about the dead. You've got murky flames, corpses. You've got this busyness again. They're crammed into spaces so that it's just so full. There's no more room. Crammed, full, busy. There's just no room because there's so many people are dead. So straight away we get the idea that this Troy is not the same as the other Troy. It's almost like the Troy after the people that landed on the beach have actually started killing them. The grief that racks him is not only for his son Hector, it is for a kingdom ravaged and threatened with extinction, for his wife Hecuba and many sons or daughters and their children who stand under his weak protection, and for Troy, once a place of refinement and of ceremonies pleasing to the gods, now in the waking dreams night after night, trouble his rest, a burnt-out shell whose citizens thought they believed in themselves, quietly asleep and safe in their beds, are the corpses he moves among. All right, so the character here tells us he's obviously the king, so he cares for Troy, he cares for his land, and it tells us that Troy is being destroyed. It's no longer, it's threatened with extinction. It's ravaged. Those aggressive words there, the aggressive diction. The reference once was pleasing to the gods. So there's this juxtaposition between what Troy was and what it is now. So if we go to the question, details of setting in text 2 that present ideas that are different. So text 2 talks about Troy, how it's destroyed, ruined, a place of death, a place that's overcrowded with people and dead people. It's also overcrowded with things. So you can imagine if people have come into siege and the people have rushed into the gates to be protected, they've all brought their stuff with them. So the whole city is crowded, overflowing, and it's very, 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 very negative sort of portrayal of Troy. So the first one, Troy was glowing, made by the gods, nestled by nature. So what you want to do there is compare. So you could say in comparison, not obviously as clumsy as that, but you'll compare, you'll say Troy in the second extract changes. Troy becomes the conquered city. It becomes the city that has now currently been destroyed by those invaders. And you can talk about the fact that destruction of the city is conveyed through the narrator, through the voice of the king, and his description of the city, but also the fact that his grief for the loss of what it was. So these two texts go perfectly together, and a lot of the time they do choose texts that go perfectly together. So the year of the snake, when they had the text about the snake, they also had a text about Pecs, and then they asked how the animals seen differently in both these texts.